Hello, everybody. This is Gary. Today is October 25th, 2021. It's 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in Rochester, New York, in the United States. And this is my coping with schizophrenia blog entry for today. Today, I'm going to go through the step-by-step process of me going to the psychiatric emergency room when I actually have to go. I've described the psychiatric emergency room briefly in other videos, but I want to describe what it's like to go to the hospital step by step, from the moment that I feel like I have to go until I actually get there, and what happens while I'm there up until the point that I'm usually ending up being discharged. What usually happens when I go to the psychiatric emergency room is that I'm usually feeling very agitated, possibly hallucinating, possibly suicidal, usually not violent, actually never violent, um, paranoid, angry, anxious, um, physically agitated, unable to sit still, hallucinations getting really bad, auditory hallucinations. And the first step when I'm feeling like that and I feel like I can't cope on my own, first thing I do is I sit down on my couch, I pick up my smartphone, I dial 911, I explain to the 911 operator that I'm feeling suicidal, I'm hallucinating, I'm very agitated, and I would like to go to the psychiatric emergency room. And usually, what the uh, 911 operator does is tell me that she's getting an ambulance started, and they will come to my apartment door. And they always come with the police in a psychiatric emergency, at least in Rochester, New York, and New York State. They send the police for safety reasons, to protect the staff of the ambulance and to make sure that I'm not violent, not carrying any weapons, to make sure that I'm not high on drugs. And if I am high on drugs, they send the police just for everybody's safety, my safety, the ambulance's safety, that kind of thing. And so what usually happens is the 911 operator will tell me not to eat or drink anything that might make me sick or cause problems for the doctor. She says she's getting the ambulance started, and she will stay on the line with me until they arrive at my door. When I say they, I mean the police. They show up first. They usually send about 2 officers. Um, and what will happen is I will sit and wait on my couch after unlocking the door, and I will wait for them to knock on my door. When they knock on my door, I will open the door and I will tell them that I'm feeling agitated, suicidal, or whatever it is that I'm feeling at that particular time. And I tell them that I want to go to the psychiatric emergency room, and they sit fine, and they will pat me down for weapons to make sure I'm not carrying any needles, anything sharp, anything that would be a weapon. Then they will say that I'm not under criminal arrest and that they have to check me just to make sure that I'm not doing anything dangerous. And then the ambulance people will come up, sometimes with a stretcher, but usually a stretcher isn't necessary because there's usually nothing wrong with me physically. So the ambulance people will come to the door after the police already arrived and talk to me, and I will tell the 911 operator that the police arrived and that I can disconnect from the phone. And so I'll hang up the phone and I will walk to the elevator of my apartment and go downstairs to the ambulance. Sometimes they'll send a psychiatric emergency team from the local crisis center. They'll ask me questions before I get in the ambulance, tell me to sign papers that gives them permission to check up on me just in case I'm not admitted into the hospital and the psychiatric emergency room sends me home. So I sign the papers and I get into the ambulance. they do not put me in handcuffs. Um, One of the things you don't do if you go to the psychiatric emergency room is argue with the police, whether you called them or not. If you called them or somebody else called them, you do not argue with the police. If they pat you down, you let them pat you down. If they tell you to do something, you do it. Otherwise, you will end up in handcuffs. And then you will be taken to the ambulance in handcuffs. Um, that's never happened to me before um, because I don't argue with the police. I don't get violent with them. And I'm the one who's actually calling for help. So what happens after that? I get into the ambulance. Um, the ambulance people ask the police if I'm voluntary or involuntary. Usually they'll say voluntary, and the police don't need to follow the ambulance. Sometimes they will if they think I'm dangerous, but they usually don't. I usually just get into the ambulance. I'm not restrained in any way. I lie in the gurney in the ambulance. They take my blood pressure. They check my oxygen levels, and then they ask me some questions like my social security number, date of birth. They check my medical records because with computers these days, the ambulance personnel have access to my medical records, and they compare my name and birth date and social security number to what they have on file. And then the ambulance will drive me to the psychiatric emergency room, and 99% of the time, it's the University of Rochester Strong Memorial Hospital CPEP unit. CPEP is the name for the psychiatric emergency room. I forget what CPEP stands for, but it's the psychiatric emergency room. What will happen is the ambulance will drive me to the emergency room. We'll go into the triage area of the emergency room. They'll put a tag on my wrist with my name, birth date, and a barcode. That way they can keep track of the patients, make sure the patients are getting the right medications, if any medications are given, make sure they're dealing with the right person at the right time, and that they're not going to make any medical mistakes. They ask me who my emergency contact is, and I usually tell them who that is. That's my friend Sue. I use her as my emergency contact instead of my family. And then what will happen is I will get off the emergency or off the ambulance gurney, and then they will put me in a chair in the psychiatric emergency room. It's one of those chairs that is like a recliner seat that you might buy at a furniture store. And what they do is they sit you there right in front of the security guards. There's usually 2 or 3 security guards, public safety officers from the University of Rochester right there in the emergency room to deal with a lot of different things, including the psychiatric emergency patients, just in case they get out of hand. And believe me, sometimes they do. I've seen it. And what usually happens like that, if someone gets nasty or violent or whatever, they will restrain the patient and they will give them medication against their will if that happens. That has happened to me. It usually doesn't, but it does sometimes. So I'm sitting in this chair next to an elevator. That elevator is actually what leads up to the psychiatric emergency department, CPEP. You wait there in the chair until the nurse says you can go upstairs. When you go upstairs, you get into the elevator. It's a locked elevator. You go upstairs into the psychiatric emergency room. The elevator opens up, the elevator closes, and once that elevator closes, you are stuck there because it's a locked ward until you talk to a psychiatrist who will decide if you need to be admitted into the hospital or if they're going to let you go. And what the security guard does when he tells you to get up there, well, the other thing, before they take you up on the elevator, they'll make sure that you're not wearing a belt. If you have a belt, to take it off. If you're wearing shoes with strings on them, they make you take your shoes off and put on a pair of socks that are designed to prevent you from slipping on the floor. So basically, you go upstairs with your regular street clothes usually, and you just won't be allowed to take up a belt or anything like a string or shoestrings or anything that you could use to harm yourself. Um, they also, before you get in the elevator, they'll do metal detector scan to make sure you're not carrying any weapons, even though the police already patted me down. And after they do all that, they take you upstairs. Now, if you're a psychiatric emergency uh, room patient and you have medical issues, then they have to clear you before they take you upstairs in the elevator. And usually, what they do in that situation is they make you take off all your clothes and put you in a hospital gown until you can get medically cleared before they send you up on the elevator to the psychiatric emergency room. Because if they send you up to the psychiatric emergency room with medical problems that haven't been checked out, then the psychiatric emergency room and the hospital could be liable for not taking care of you properly. If you have some sort of physical medical issue going on, it has to be checked out by a medical doctor before they let you go upstairs to the psychiatric emergency room. But once, assuming you've been medically cleared and you go up to the psychiatric emergency room, the security guard will tell you to take a seat somewhere until somebody can talk to you. And usually, what they do is they do again what they call triage. A psychiatric nurse will come out of the nursing station, which is covered in glass, to separate the patients from the nursing staff and the doctor staff, so the patients can't like break the glass or attack the nurses or anything like that. Um, and if you need to talk to a nurse, there's a window that you can knock on and it slides open like a door. And if you need something from the nurse, you could ask the nurse that way. But anyways, you get up there on the elevator closes, you're locked in there until you can see a psychiatrist. You take a seat, there are no beds up there in this particular psychiatric emergency room. It's at Strong Memorial Hospital, University of Rochester, New York. Um, you sit in a chair, again, a recliner chair, or a chair that pulls out like a bed, and you either sit down or lie down. Again, these are not beds, these are chairs or recliner chairs. A combination are scattered throughout the psychiatric emergency room. Um, and a few minutes after getting up there, a nurse will come out and talk to you just to get an idea of why you came in, who brought you in, what were the circumstances of why you came to the hospital, that sort of thing. They'll ask you if you need anything, and I'll usually tell them that because I'm a smoker, or a former smoker at this point, I would need nicotine gum because I don't know how long I'm going to be there and I'm going to have cigarette cravings and nicotine cravings. So they'll usually let me have nicotine gum. If I'm feeling agitated, I might ask for my Klonopin because right now I am allowed to take 1 milligram of Klonopin a day. And if Klonopin is on my outpatient medication list, they'll usually allow me to take the Klonopin. It's a controlled substance. If Klonopin is not on my outpatient medication list and I ask for Klonopin, I usually won't get it. But anyways, the last visit I went in, it was very crowded. There was 45 people in a space that was meant for at maximum 20. But the psychiatric emergency room at Strong Memorial Hospital isn't allowed to turn anyone away. So it can get very, very crowded, especially on the weekends when everything is closed. And the last time I went into the psychiatric emergency room, the nurse talked to me, asked me questions, asked me if I was using drugs, alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, anything like that. Sometimes they may or may not do a urine test for drugs. For me, they usually don't. If I'm agitated, like I said, they might give me Klonopin. They might give me Zyprexa for my hallucinations and my delusions, my paranoia, if those are the primary reasons I came into the hospital. Um, so the last time I went, a psychiatric nurse came out to talk to me, and I spent the next 26 hours being extremely agitated, almost getting into a fight with a couple of different patients. Um, they ended up giving me 2 Klonopins, which is benzodiazepines or controlled substance. They also gave me, over several hours, 2 Ativans, which again are benzodiazepines or controlled substances. They gave me 100 milligrams of Seroquel for my psychotic symptoms, as well as Zyprexa. And I started vomiting, which is common for me when I get really agitated. It's just a reaction my body has to anxiety. They gave me a shot of Zofran, which is an anti-nausea medication. And then I ended up spending 26 hours in the psychiatric emergency room, spending most of my time lying on a chair that's pulled out like a bed. The bottom of the chair pulls out, and you can lie down. And you pretty much, that's all you have to do there. While you're there, there's nothing else to do. And so I got agitated several times throughout the 26 hours that I was there. I was on the bottom of the list to see a psychiatrist because I was one of the last people to come into the emergency room. And it's usually you're seen by the order in which you came in. And when I came in, there was already 45 people up there. So it took more than a day, more than 24 hours for me to even see a psychiatrist. But at the same time, they were still giving me medications from the doctor, even though I actually hadn't talked to the doctor, which is common when you get agitated and you might get violent. They did not strap me down. They did not give me medication against my will. I actually asked for the medication. I told them that I was agitated. They needed to give me something to calm me down. So they ended up giving me 2 Klonopins, 2 Ativans, Seroquel, Zyprexa, and Zofran for the vomiting. So I spent 26 hours or so lying on a chair, and finally, after 26 hours, the psychiatrist came out to talk to me and asked me if I was suicidal or violent. I said no, and I didn't appear to be violent or suicidal while I was up there for the 26 hours. So I was discharged, or at least the process of being discharged has begun. And what that usually means is they ask you, do you actually have a place to go to if you're going to be discharged? An apartment, a house, a room that you're renting. And if you don't, they'll usually send you to a home or shelter. I obviously have an apartment. So what they do is they arrange for a taxi to take you home. In my case, I have Medicaid, so that would pay for the taxi to go home. The social worker also has to talk to you before the psychiatrist does. The social worker will come out, talk to you, get some information, and then the psychiatrist will come out and talk to you and evaluate you. And then that's when they'll either admit you into the hospital or discharge you. If they discharge you, they'll find out where you're going, arrange transportation, whether that's a cab or the bus, and then they'll send you to wherever you're going as far as going home, whether that's an apartment, a house, a rented room, or a homeless shelter. Um, if they decide you need to be admitted into the hospital, then you have to wait in the psychiatric emergency room until they find a bed for you somewhere. If the University of Rochester itself doesn't have any available inpatient beds, they'll check other hospitals to see if they have inpatient beds available, and then they'll send you to another hospital if those beds are available. If there are no beds available in Rochester, they may very well send you to Newark, New York, which is a psychiatric hospital, or they may even send you to Buffalo. Um, and that's all depending on whether or not the University of Rochester itself has any psychiatric beds. And if they can't find you any beds in another city, you're stuck in the emergency room until they find you a bed. And that could be several days, which gets extremely boring. There's nothing to do but lie down or watch television. And it can get very noisy, very agitated for people. People often get violent. They get strapped onto a bed. They get injected with medications to calm them down. People yell and scream at each other. They get in each other's way. They swear at each other. They swear at the nurses. They swear at the doctors. I've done that myself. And it could get all very, very chaotic. And if they admit you into the hospital and they don't have any beds, that's just going to agitate you even more, because then you have to stay in the psychiatric emergency room until they find you a bed, which I have had to go through. Usually when I did get admitted, sometimes they would wait 2-3 days and see if I really still need to be admitted in the hospital. And sometimes they'll evaluate me and say I no longer need to be admitted. And after spending 2 or 3 days in the emergency room, they send me home anyways, even though I was officially admitted into the hospital. I often feel pressured to leave the hospital when I'm not ready to go because they don't have any beds. But if you're not actively violent or suicidal, they won't allow you to stay there. They just don't have enough inpatient psychiatric beds available usually. The whole system is broken. It sucks. The lack of psychiatric beds is why there's so many homeless mentally ill people who are psychotic, hallucinating, talking to themselves, using drugs, using alcohol on the streets, spending time on the corners talking to themselves while they're smoking cigarettes. It's all a really broken, shitty system. But they either admit you in the hospital or they send you home. One thing you should not do if you go into the psychiatric emergency room is become violent or threaten violence. Because if you actually hit somebody or attack them, you can actually get arrested. Even if you're in the psychiatric emergency room, if you become violent and you attack someone, they can press charges against you and you can be taken out of the psychiatric emergency room and thrown in jail. Because assaulting other people, whether you're mentally ill or not, is a crime, and you can be charged with a crime if you assault somebody else. So that's something you definitely do not want to do in the psychiatric emergency room, is attack other people, whether it's a patient, a nurse, or a doctor, social worker, or anyone else that's up there. So that's my step-by-step description of what happens when you go to the psychiatric emergency room. Of course, not everybody is lucid enough when they go into the psychiatric emergency room to control their behavior. The cops show up, they may be high on drugs, they may be psychotic and violent, and the police may have no choice but to restrain them in handcuffs, put them in a police car, take them to the psychiatric emergency room, and that kind of thing under restraints. But if you're lucid enough to think clearly enough, if you do go to the psychiatric emergency room or somebody else has called the police and the ambulance and you're going to the psychiatric emergency room, whether you like it or not, do not fight with the police. That's just stupid. You're just going to get restrained with handcuffs and you're still going to go to the psychiatric emergency room and you're still going to sit there. So it makes no sense to fight with the police. It makes no point to argue with the police. Follow the police's instructions. If they want to pat you down, let them pat you down. If they want to see your identification, give them your identification. If they want to do a drug test, do the urine drug test. Just do what you're told. It makes things a hell of a lot easier and it reduces the chances of you going to jail for committing a crime that was violent during your process of going to the psychiatric emergency room. So that's my basic description of going to the University of Rochester Psychiatric Emergency Room. And that's about it. Like, share, comment, subscribe. If you want to help my channel, I'll leave a PayPal donation link in the description. Share my videos on social media like Facebook and Twitter. It helps my channel grow. Press the notification bell for when I put out new videos. And if you want me to do a video on a specific topic, let me know in the comment section.